Hello, I'm HMV News Deputy Editor Neil Merrett, and welcome to our latest Heatingcast. This is the second part of the podcast looking at the role electrification may play in the government's planned decarbonisation of UK homes. The recent publication of a 10-point decarbonisation plan, described by government as a green industrial revolution, expects to rely on a mix of heat technologies, including gas, electric and district solutions. Meanwhile, proposals set out by the Committee on Climate Change in its latest carbon budget expect heat pumps, running ideally on a supply of renewable electricity, to meet the majority of heat demand alongside district heat in the next 30 years. So how then can government, through a mixture of policy and regulation, begin to curb the nation's reliance on fossil fuel heating and ensure electric alternatives can be ramped up accordingly? This is a key theme of our latest podcast. To discuss this, I'm joined once again by James Standley, Managing Director of Kensa Heat Pumps, Tom Robbins of Home Control Specialist Switchee, and Phil Steele of renewables provider Octopus Energy. I started by asking the panel what policy or regulatory changes they believe will be vital to begin effectively electrifying the UK's heating. Phil Steele said a good place to start was building regulations that are already in the process of being revised.
So if we start with building standards, there isn't enough awareness and enough support for electrified heat in the building standards with new build. So outside my window I can see a new build development going on, and I know they're not putting air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps into that set of properties. In a village a few miles away they put air source heating on the back of those properties. Now there they did it because there wasn't a gas network to connect into, so it was put in for that reason rather than because the building standards supported it. So I'd like to see more kind of building standard support for for heating technologies like that.
Excellent. And if I move across then, and Tom as well, from Switchee's view there, what would you see perhaps as the priorities that you'd like to see change that would actually get us not just talking, but you know, having the important discussions of contracts and things and getting these solutions put in?
I think that one of the big changes that we would like to see is just a bit of a rethink around EPC and the grading system. It's been transformational in getting people to think about the way that we score houses, and we now love the idea we can turn up to our rental home or the home we're going to buy and we get a grading against it, and that's a really, really nice consumer engagement. I think it needs a bit of a rethink, and now we've got the technology, let's start thinking about actually the energy performance of a vehicle. Why don't we look at how many kilowatt hours it takes to maintain this property at 25 degrees C, for example. We can measure that. We've got the smart meters information starting to come through. We've got the technology out there. We've got the smart technology to be able to do that. I really think that the EPC looking at actually holistically, how do we reduce people's burden and decarbonise? I think we've got the tool in place. Let's use it differently. Let's revise it. Let's rethink about it.
Excellent. And James, and coming back around to yourself with that extra view, I know my boss at this point would always say it's how do we get more people taking heat pumps, but on a wider level, what really was Kensa like to see or expect to see or perhaps hope to see with regards to?
Absolutely agree that building standards and SAP and how all that works together is an area where reform would help significantly. As has been mentioned earlier, one of the things that Kensa is doing is installing larger district arrays with multiple heat pumps on a single ground array. Call it an ambient loop, call it a shared ground array, call it a fifth generation heating and cooling system, whatever you want to call it. That concept of putting that infrastructure in the ground, we think has a really big part to play in enabling that transformation on a street-by-street basis, enabling that transformation to happen in a planned manner rather than a fire sale because my oil boiler is broken, so I'm going to need to do something as quick as possible. And doing whatever is as quick as possible isn't going to be the best for the UK energy system as a whole. You're going to end up with the cheapest, dirtiest thing that gets them warm as quickly as possible. So a planned approach. Unfortunately, that requires some joined-up thinking from policymakers, which we haven't always been as good as we might have wanted to be on that one. So recognising that infrastructure in the ground is a long-term strategic asset, and supporting the installation of that on a phased basis, I think would be really good policy reform. And then I'll also mention that the different levies that we have on gas and electricity. Currently, you've got all kinds of levies and extra things that make electricity more expensive, and you don't have those on gas. So right now, it pays to pollute because of the current price and the differential between the two fuels.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well. I was wondering, James, if flexibility is an issue here in between different households, different communities. We were talking a minute ago about heat pumps being adopted on one building because gas was less of an option. But I guess I was wondering if there's a sense of flexibility in that obviously it's rather than just, oh, this is the alternative to, it can't be gas, so it must be electric. A sense of actually looking perhaps deeping down into the information, into data, and into sort of understanding, well that property, that block may be more suited to electric and gas, as opposed to at the minute, well, the constraints are there on gas, so electric has to be, it's an alternative in that way. If that makes sense, with regards to a more flexible grid, perhaps a more flexible approach to properties and the types of heat that they're better suited to handle.
As I said, there's not one silver bullet. There are a number of properties where one system works better than another, and yes, we are going to have to look at those a little bit on a case-by-case basis. Our view, of course, is that we haven't come across a property or a group of properties where a ground source heat pump is not technically possible. We have come across those where currently it doesn't make economic sense right now, but not technically impossible. And that's an important distinction as we look at why a consumer or an UK energy system might choose one thing or another.
Well, I know we've talking about we were talking earlier about sort of myths and perceptions again about what things are to what things can be, especially I guess as we're making long term. We need to have sort of longer term plans now for the next 30 years about how things change there. To go across the panel, I had a few questions sort of breaking down the different areas once again that controls, that energy supply will all play in this alongside the heating technology. So, Tom, I was going to come to you from the view of Switchee there. It was just to get an idea of, obviously we talk about sort of a digital age, digital transformation and smart integrated energy systems. And I was trying to get an idea of how this approach might impact our relationship with energy use in the home, particularly when it comes to, obviously, heating primarily is what we're talking today, but obviously all the different needs of, there's a lot of talk of the role electric vehicles may play there as well. So it was to get an idea of what this idea of sort of integrated systems, integrated energy system within a home may sort of mean with how we're getting energy and how we're using it there.
I think for a lot of the early adopters, what we're talking about as the future already exists and is being used every day. You see, I've got sort of friends and myself. I'm pretty passionate about being aware of the way we use energy, and the technology, largely off the shelf for not a particularly large amount of money, is available. I think the challenge is that it requires me to have a particular passion and interest to stitch it all together. It's that stitching it together that we need to, that's the barrier that we need to reduce, and to be able to provide sort of standard platforms where people that perhaps aren't early adopters and perhaps aren't quite so passionate but really do want to understand how they can reduce their energy consumption are able to engage with the platform more easily. Switchee predominantly works with social housing landlords, and it's not a market where people necessarily have the spare money to invest in a platform.
Yeah.
So we're doing our best to be that platform and to be able to provide people with not just the awareness of how their home is from a comfort perspective, but actually how their home is consuming energy as well, and all the various components in that, whether that's their water, whether that's their power, whether that's their heating. But I think the awareness now is people want to understand, they're passionate about understanding more. It's about giving them a platform rather than having them have to stitch these pieces together.
Yeah. Smart technologies and controls. These are systems which can use a range of data and end-user information to better automate heat and energy storage, are often cited by policymakers and industry experts as being an integral part of decarbonisation and electrification in the long run. However, this concept is now seemingly evolving to focus much more on the holistic management of energy in homes. I asked Phil Steele how we could expect this shift in concept to begin impacting heating systems.
So smart technology is happening in lots of different areas. So whether it's solar, battery, EVs, heating and hot water, and even you can look at appliances, dishwashers, fridges, freezers, washing machines, dryers and so on. The concept of the smart home has been around for quite a long time, and it's always kind of had this difficult position. Where does it really fit? Because it's kind of the consumer benefits were not that strong. Now what we're starting to see is that smart home is evolving into, call it the home energy management system, the HEMS. And now it's got a real reason, because it can help you with your energy cost in any market, or it can actually also, because we can tie it to the price of energy, it can help you become greener in the way in which you're using energy as well. So if you look on a website called carbonintensity.org, you can actually see the level of CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour per, I think it's about a 5-minute interval throughout the day. And we've actually exposed that API to the Amazon Alexa device, so you can ask it how green is energy right now. And customers are kind of reacting that in ways as well, and say, I'll use energy when it is greener. My example of as the clocks went back at 1 a.m. on Sunday, the rates actually went negative because there was a lot of wind generation on the grid. In terms of tariffs then, the Agile tariff gives customers that insight to how green energy is, because renewable energy tends to be much lower priced than carbon-based energy, and therefore through the algorithm that Agile is priced on, it's reflected in the lower price. When we launched Agile more than 2 years ago, we included an API as well, and the API is completely public, so anybody can take that API and do things with it. So on our blog, Octopus Energy blog, I've written a lot of articles about all sorts of interesting companies and products, and even individual developers who have created apps, spreadsheet tools, all sorts of analytics, and connected up devices to it as well. Solar battery systems are connected to it. Charge when it's cheap, discharge when the export version of Agile is high, run your hot water at different times of day. With air source and ground source heat pumps, it's slightly different though. You can still do it, but you're running at a more balanced heating profile. But there are still controls that you can apply to those to turn the pumps up and down, the speed up and down and things. And maybe you look at having a threshold of prices of a temperature, a higher threshold and a lower temperature. So heat higher when the price is low and vice versa. But then you mentioned their storage as well. So a lot of customers that are putting in solar are now also putting in battery storage systems. So they're storing that spare capacity, or even charging the batteries when the prices are low. And you could run your heat pump at a continuous target temperature instead of coping with a kind of comfort threshold, because you're using the stored energy in clever ways. Or you look at other products like SunAmp and others that have got heat storage. So if you're generating heat, put it into heat storage. So there's no need to kind of transfer it from one energy source store to another store, from electric to heat and so on. The more times you change energy from one state to another, then the less efficiency it is. You have losses. So you now start to see, well, actually heat can be stored and then drawn from that at certain times of day. There's another interesting startup, Tepio, that have got, it's like a very large night storage heater about the size of a dishwasher, runs at several hundred degrees internally, and then releases that heat out through the existing radiator system. They're just in trials and got their first launches and things out now. But it's another alternative electric heating solution.
Considering the different specialisms that the panel have in providing new forms of controls, energy services and tariffs, or heating technologies such as ground source heat pumps, I was curious how they believed their industries needed to develop and change to bring these different focuses together in a more simplified, singular package for consumers. I started by asking James Standley then how government ambitions to drastically ramp up heat pump use in particular will be achieved in the coming years.
Exciting future. There's a lot of really good stuff going on. The long-term outlook, I think, is very good for electrification of heat. So we've got all the right solutions. We're already delivering the lowest cost, lowest carbon heat. As Tom said, for early adopters, the solutions are there right now. The user acceptance bit is really important. I was interested to know that my electricity was negative on Sunday morning. My wife was not, for instance. Phil, you're absolutely right that storage is going to be an increasing part of how we approach this as a whole system, whether that's electric storage or heat storage. That's going to be an interesting part of understanding how we balance a less certain electricity grid with more renewable generation, and how we make sure that the devices that we're putting on the other end are able to react to that flexibility as much as possible. Developing over the next 3 years, I see more integration, more examples like the Energy Super Hub Oxford, where all three of us are working together to make the whole system work as well as possible. So that in addition to providing the lowest carbon, lowest cost heat, it's also the lowest impact on the electricity grid as well.
Brilliant, that's great. And Tom, from Switchee's view of perhaps where, again, this next decade, this sort of 8 to 10 year mark, where do you think you'll be from perhaps where you are now to then in terms of the development of the market?
I think for this market, it's incredibly frustrating how slow it moves, but we also need to respect how slow it moves. Typically we're going to be you change your boiler every 10, 12 years. So even if you had a fantastic idea today, then you're still talking 10 years, 12 years before it rolls out across everyone. I just want to stress is quite how material it is for all the new stuff that is happening today. I mean, it's incredible. We love the work we're doing with Kensa and quite how forward-thinking they are, and some of the big projects they're working on at the moment. Those are really exciting. But I suppose looking even further upstate, about 75% of our inbound inquiries are interested in heat pump control capability, solar control capability, battery control capability. We've been working on a next generation of our device now for a couple of years that has this today because people want it in their specifications today. So I know it can be immensely frustrating as we look around and say, why isn't everyone doing this today? There is a natural pace in the industry that only it can take so long to roll out across everywhere. I suppose from what we see, which are maybe slightly self-selecting the people who get in touch with us, but most people are planning this kind of works. Some people are doing this kind of works right now, and I think over the next 10 years, this is going to happen at pace. In 8-9 years' time, it will be the way it is, but it is going to take that long to get there.
Definitely, that sounds brilliant. And Phil, yourself there from obviously Octopus's view, and as a provider, and with the work you're already doing, how again does that sort of develop in terms of the future outlook, or are we, as perhaps the panelists saying, we're perhaps already there in some of the ways? It's that expansion a little bit now of that.
So what we see is that the amount of renewable generation on the grid is increasing dramatically. We were hitting 50% even last year. Problem with renewable energy is it's very intermittent. So you just watch a semi-cloudy day go over, and if you watch the output of solar generation in real time, you'll see the level of kilowatts that it's producing falls and rises dramatically. Same with wind. So as we saw on Sunday, when we get really strong windy days, there's a huge amount of wind generation. Now that intermittency is very different from the old fossil fuel world of gas power stations, and you still got nuclear there as backup and things, but it's very flat, very controllable. The fact that renewable generation is so intermittent, and yet it's starting to make up such a big proportion of the energy mix, and it's very distributed, means that storage is going to be important. And then combine that with electric cars, which are growing at a really fast rate now, as well as electric heating, the amount of electricity that we're all going to consume is just going to keep increasing. So then you kind of combine that increased demand from those technologies and the intermittency, and you start to need that combination of storage and smart technology and also flexibility markets. So flexibility markets are going to expand as well. And then applying controls to all of that is where it kind of all comes together. I think that's the direction that we're seeing.
Excellent. That brings us to the end of this discussion on heat electrification, as well as the interconnected challenge of energy management, storage and controls. There'll be plenty more to discuss on the matter over the coming year here at HMEUs, not least with our Low Carbon Heating Summit set for later in 2021. But in the meantime, I'd just like to thank our podcast electrification panel. They are James Standley, Managing Director of Kensa Heat Pumps, Tom Robbins of Home Controls Specialist Switchee, and Phil Steele of Renewables provider Octopus Energy. If you haven't already, do catch up with the previous Heatingcast that looked at heat electrification. You'll find that in the link below. We hope you'll join us again for our next podcast. Goodbye.